Chapter 15. After 2 weeks of working every evening from a primer, Conrad could read well enough to get by. Isabel had borrowed it from the new teacher at the Belle Fourche school where Lulu used to teach. It turned out his mind had wanted the exercise, and with such a pleasant teacher, the work had gone quickly, when he wasn't trying to steal a kiss for every little success. He was now ready to start into his second book. She had mentioned to him that she was ready to think about the bakery, but he hadn't wanted to talk about it. After a few weeks of having her all to himself, he didn't want to give her up all day. But her desire to do something, to fill a deep need within her, to be busier than anyone else, was so strong, he could feel it coursing through her when he held her close. After a short knock on Conrad's door, Isabel came in and left the door open. She grew prettier by the day. Even in her plain calico, she was a beauty. He stood from his place at the table where he'd been practicing ahead of time. There was a nervousness about her, in the way she stood a bit off, and her glance never quite lit on him. "Conrad, my parents are here. They've come to take me home." He shoved his chair, sending it to the floor and making her flinch away from him. "No!" The word escaped before he could stop it, but he couldn't dictate her whereabouts any more than her parents could. She was a woman with her own mind. "Unless you want to go." Why wouldn't she look at him? She shook her head and stepped forward, finally gazing up at him. "I don't know what to say. I don't want to be disrespectful, but they don't understand." He didn't understand either. "Do they know? Did you tell them that we'll be married when the time is right?" She shook her head. "I wrote the letter before you asked me. It was only about Harlan's death, and I finally told them the truth about everything he'd done." He couldn't keep from touching her any more than he could keep from blinking. He pulled her close and pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head. The perfect spot when she was in his arms. "They may be here thinking you need to be at home in your grief. We'll tell them together." Isabel shook her head and drew away from him. "No, you don't understand. They loved him. They were so angry when they saw I wasn't in mourning. They came because I signed my letter with my maiden name. I don't want any part of him anymore." "They didn't believe you? Or they just think mourning is appropriate since you're a widow?" He couldn't quite understand how her parents could side with the man who had done nothing but hurt their only daughter. "I don't know." She rested her forehead against his chest. "I just know that I don't want to go with them. I wasn't allowed to be in mourning for my child, and I won't mourn the man who killed it." The answer seemed obvious to him, but would she see it that way? She was the same age as Barton, 21, and her parents had no legal stand to control her. "Isabel, they can't make you do anything you don't want to. You already know I want you here with me, but I can't make you stay any more than they can make you go. The choice is yours." She gently ran her hand up and down his chest, then paused over his heart. "I've never wanted to be anywhere more than I want to be right here with you. I'm meant to be with you." "Then let's go talk to them together." He turned and led her from the house. As he turned to close the door, a bullet whizzed by his head and lodged in the doorframe. Isabel screamed, and he grabbed for her, but she ran as another shot cracked in the distance. He slammed to his belly to make himself a harder target. Isabel slipped into the nearest barn, and he sighed his relief that she was no longer out in the open. He could focus without her in the line of fire. As he searched the rolling hills for any sign of the shooter, he held his breath. They hadn't seen any sign of Stan for weeks. Arnold peered out from the corner of the bullpen shelter and pointed toward the main house. The shooter was smart. None of them would ever return fire at their parents' home, not when they knew Ma was in there. He scanned the flower beds and corners, but nothing moved and there were no more shots. Conrad got to his feet, crouching low as he ran, and met his brother in the cover of the machine shed. "What was all that about?" Arnold shook his head. "Don't know, but I'm guessing Stan or one of his friends is back. He only aimed at you, not at Izzy or me, and we were both in plain sight when the shots started." They strode for the house as two people came out the front door, followed by Ma. "Boys, what's going on out here?" She glared at them as if they were children horsing around. Arnold ignored her question and parted the short bush at the front corner of the house. He bent down and held up a shell casing. "Here's where he was hiding. He had to have slipped away, back around the house. He could be anywhere now. Isabel." Conrad spun around and searched for her. She hadn't come out of the barn yet, and he prayed it was only because she was still terrified. "Wait!" the man on the porch yelled. Conrad gritted his teeth and stopped. He turned back to the man as he came down the stairs. He needed to know Isabel was safe, and waiting built a fury in him that was hard to contain. "I'm Nelson Harmon, Izzy's father. I'd like to come with you." Conrad nodded, but only because he wanted to get going and find Isabel. He strode toward the barn, leaving the older man to follow. Mr. Harmon remained silent as Conrad slipped through the door. He had hoped Isabel would be right out where they could see her, waiting for him, but a frightened woman might go anywhere. He softly called for her, not wanting to scare her further. "Isabel?" Mr. Harmon started searching the pins, and Conrad went to the loft ladder. He wouldn't have chosen it as a hiding place himself. In a gunfight, it would trap you in a position, but Isabel wouldn't know that. Once in the loft, he searched through all the hay in the area wired off for chickens. She wasn't there. The ladder was a waste of precious time, and he jumped from the loft back down to the barn. Mr. Harmon met him there. "She isn't in here. You're sure this is where you saw her run?" He nodded and strode for the back door. A slip of paper lay on the ground. He growled as he swiped it up. Time for a trade. Mr. Harmon glanced over Conrad's shoulder at the note. "What does it mean?" He crumpled the sheet into his fist. "It means Stan wants to die." The little schoolhouse wasn't as welcoming as when she had borrowed the books for Conrad. Isabel lay huddled against the wall where her captor had tossed her. Next to her, the new teacher cowered, clinging to her. She was young and terrified, fresh from the normal school in Spearfish. Isabel had gathered from his ranting that the man who held them was Stan, the man who had cornered Conrad between the barns. His buddy was supposed to have taken care of Conrad for good, but the shot didn't take. She wasn't about to tell him his friend's aim had been true. Conrad had been saved by the hand of God, and hopefully his hand was over her, and the new teacher as well. Stan paced the front of the classroom, intermittently scratching his chin and rubbing his hands together in barely contained glee. "I wrote a note. A note. The simpleton can't read it. He'll be so worried about you that he'll have to ask someone for help. It was one easy sentence, and he'll have to ask for help. Then everyone will know." His breathing came faster as he spoke, and he squeaked as he laughed. His building agitation pushed her closer to the wall, as small as she could make herself. If he didn't notice either of them, he would stay over there, far from them. The more he spoke, the more she was sure he wasn't in his right mind, and that terrified her. The blonde next to her whispered prayers with her eyes locked tightly shut. Stan hadn't told her what he'd planned for them, but it couldn't be good. They had seen his face, and she knew his intent for Conrad. He couldn't let her go and hope to get away. If she kept her wits, she might be able to do some good before he killed her. She might be able to prevent Stan from killing Conrad. As long as Conrad made it, that was all that mattered. Stan bore down on her and stared with wide eyes. His hair hadn't been trimmed in quite some time, and his beard had grown in uneven, giving him the look of a squatter.
It might take a bit for him to get the courage to ask for help. He's a sneaky sort. I didn't catch on that he was literate until he refused to write me a list a few times.
He turned from her and headed back to the front of the room.
Then I had to give him a few tests, and he failed.
Stan paced from one side of the room to the other, glancing out every window. He was just like Harland, controlling and cruel, but Harland had never taken leave of his senses like Stan had. She could handle someone like Harland, but would the same things work on Stan? When faced with someone stronger, better, or smarter, Harland would slink away every time. She prayed Stan would as well. He isn't illiterate. In fact, he can read quite well. I've listened to him. Stan spun and faced her.
You've been fooled, girl. He's dumb as a stump and twice as wide.
She pulled against her hands tied behind her back, extricating herself from the grip of the teacher, and slid up the wall to stand. He couldn't cow her as easily if she wasn't on the floor. I taught him how, though he knew most everything he needed before we even began. So, how much of your plan relies on him asking for help that he won't need? She paused to let him think about her words for a minute. He's going to be madder than a mud hornet. The color drained from his face for a moment.
No matter. The men will take care of anyone who tries to leave the Broken Circle O. I set plenty of them along the road. Conrad will watch his whole family die, all because he needed to ask them for help to read a simple note.
And if they're dead, just what do you have planned for me? We are on the edge of town. People will hear you if you shoot me. He glanced to the rafters.
Maybe I'll just get a rope. Might take 5 or 6 minutes, but you'll be quiet. Can't yell when the rope gets tight. But I need you here for now. That lout will watch you swing. I lost everything, and that big dumb fool has never lost anything.
Isabel tamped down the sick dread in her stomach. If she was to face death, she wouldn't let him see her fear. I don't understand why. Why did Conrad bother you so much that you'd want to kill him or his family? They gave you a good job, which you just threw to the wind. He grabbed her by the hair and yanked her back down onto the floor.
I had a ranch on the other side of town. My pa had a good plot, and then the drought hit and he lost everything. I knew all there was to know about running a ranch, and I was reduced to being a wrangler for a man who couldn't even read his own deed. My pa died in shame, not owning a thing.
Isabel wished she had been one of those pioneering women she'd read about from 30 or 40 years before, who carried their own guns or knives. She had neither. All she had on her was her kerchief, and whatever she could find in the classroom, which wasn't much. The room hadn't been used since last Christmas, when Lula had announced to the board she couldn't continue. The poor new teacher had been inside cleaning when Stan had busted in with Isabel over his shoulder. Her pa and ma had come to the ranch that day, too. Now they would certainly want to take her away. Staying was dangerous. If she made it out of the school alive...
"Ain't you got nothing to say, girl?"
He laughed. She narrowed her eyes. I don't see any sense in talking with the likes of you. You wouldn't understand anyway. What a fool plan. You left a note so Conrad would ask for help. Then you planned to have your men kill his family? Why does it matter then? Anyone who knows his secret would be dead. Did she dare to push him further? He stopped his pacing and stared at her.
"Because I want the land for myself."
Isabel didn't know the particulars of the Olson land, but she did know how to make men like Stan think. Even if every man who could ride was killed today, you still wouldn't own it. It wouldn't be for sale.
There are 3 women owners and 1 heir, and I'm not telling you who they are."
A huge group of riders rode toward town, making more clatter than Stan could ignore. He strode to the window and peered out. From where she stood, it was little more than a huge cloud of dust and riders, just a group of men coming to town. Stan yanked his gun from his holster, and Isabel slid flat against the floor and yanked herself under the nearest row of desks, squeaking to the teacher to join her. It wouldn't stop a bullet, but he might not find her either. The blonde crawled to her under the tiny row of desks.
"What's your name?" Isabel asked, "so I can pray for us." "Stevinia. Please, tell me we aren't going to die." "I can't promise any such thing. Just hold tight to Jesus."